Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind the noise of the modern world and traveling thousands of years into the past. So relax, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift across the endless golden deserts beside the Great Nile River. Tonight, we enter the mysterious world of ancient Egypt, a land of massive pyramids, silent temples, powerful pharaohs, and royal families whose secrets remained buried beneath the sands for thousands of years. When we think about ancient Egypt, we usually imagine golden treasures, magnificent palaces, and rulers who looked almost like gods. And in a way, that is exactly how the Egyptians saw them. The pharaoh was not simply a king, he was believed to be a living connection between humans and the gods. He controlled the land, commanded armies, and was responsible for keeping order throughout the entire kingdom. That is a very heavy responsibility for one person. Imagine waking up every morning knowing you must rule a great civilization, solve political problems, satisfy priests, and somehow maintain the balance of the universe. No pressure at all. But behind the perfect stone statues and golden crowns was a different reality. The pharaohs were human beings. They experienced fear, illness, loneliness, and the burden of endless expectations. One of the strangest traditions of the Egyptian royal family was their practice of marrying close relatives. Many pharaohs married their sisters or other family members because they believed royal blood was sacred and connected to the gods. To modern people, this seems unusual and difficult to understand, but for the ancient royal family, it was a symbol of divine power. Unfortunately, keeping the bloodline so limited sometimes created health problems that affected future generations. Perhaps the most famous example is the young king Tutankhamun. Today, the world remembers his beautiful golden mask and the incredible treasures discovered inside his tomb. The mask showed a powerful and eternal ruler, but the young person behind that mask lived a much more fragile life. Tutankhamun became pharaoh when he was only a child. Imagine being a young boy and suddenly being told that an entire kingdom now depends on you. Most children worry about games and daily lessons. Tutankhamun had the weight of an empire placed on his shoulders. His advisors helped control many of the important decisions of the kingdom. Modern studies of his remains suggest he had physical problems and may have struggled to walk comfortably. Inside his tomb, many walking sticks were discovered, a quiet reminder that behind the image of a perfect god was a young human being dealing with his own struggles. This is perhaps the greatest secret of ancient Egypt. The statues show us perfection. History shows us humanity. The ancient Egyptians were also deeply fascinated with what happened after death. They believed death was not the end of existence. Instead, it was the beginning of another journey. Because of this belief, they spent enormous amounts of time preparing for the afterlife. Pharaohs built magnificent tombs filled with jewelry, furniture, clothing, and treasures that they believed would help them in the next world. It was almost like preparing a palace for an eternal journey. Of course, the owner would not move in until after death. The Egyptians developed the incredible process known as mummification. This complex ritual could take many weeks. The body was carefully preserved using natural materials, wrapped in linen, and protected through religious ceremonies. The heart was usually left inside the body because Egyptians believed it contained a person's emotions, memories, and intelligence. The brain, however, was considered much less important, a rather unfortunate opinion for the organ that had spent an entire lifetime doing all the thinking. Ancient beliefs can sometimes be very surprising. Another mystery that continues to amaze the modern world is the construction of the pyramids. These giant structures were built as monuments that would survive long after the pharaohs were gone. Every ruler understood that one day their body would disappear, their palace would become ruins, and their voice would become silent. So they created something that could speak for them forever. Great mountains of stone standing proudly in the desert. A message to future generations saying, "I lived, I ruled, remember me." And thousands of years later, we still do. But these treasures also brought danger. Many tombs attracted thieves who searched for gold and valuable objects. Imagine spending years creating the perfect home for eternity, only for someone to enter and say, "This looks expensive, I think I will take it." Some parts of human nature never truly change. Power, wealth, ambition, and greed have existed in every civilization. Ancient Egypt was no different. Behind every beautiful temple was a story of politics. Behind every royal marriage was a struggle for power. And behind every golden mask was a person with hopes, fears, and weaknesses. The greatest pharaohs tried to become immortal, but the reason we still remember them today is not because they were perfect, it is because they were human. Their stories continue to whisper through the ancient sands of the Nile, waiting for someone to listen. And tonight, our journey into the dark secrets of ancient Egypt has only just begun. As our journey continues deeper into ancient Egypt, the stories become even more complicated. Because this was not only a land of pyramids and pharaohs, it was also a place where power was fragile, ambition was dangerous, and even the royal family could become a battlefield. Behind the golden walls of the palace, one question quietly shaped the future of Egypt. Who truly holds power when the pharaoh is weak? In many cases, the answer was not the king himself, but the people standing just behind him, the priests, the advisors, and sometimes the queens. In ancient Egypt, royal women were not always silent figures in the background. Some of them were powerful, intelligent, and politically skilled enough to influence entire kingdoms. One of the most remarkable examples of this hidden power comes from a queen named Hatshepsut. At first, she was not meant to rule Egypt. She was meant to support the throne, marry a pharaoh, and remain in the traditional role expected of royal women. But history rarely follows expectations. When the male heir to the throne was too young to rule, Hatshepsut stepped forward as regent. At first, she governed in his name, but over time, something unusual began to happen. She did not step back when the young king grew older. Instead, she stepped forward even further, and eventually she declared herself pharaoh, not queen, not regent, but king of Egypt. To strengthen her authority, she even adopted the symbols of male pharaohs in statues and carvings, a beard that was not natural, a posture designed to represent traditional kingship. It was not deception, it was survival. Because in the world she lived in, power often required reinvention. Under her rule, Egypt experienced a period of stability and prosperity. Temples were built, trade expanded, and the kingdom flourished quietly under a ruler who was never meant to sit on the throne. But after her death, something equally fascinating happened too. Her legacy was slowly erased. Monuments were defaced. Her name was removed from records, as if someone tried to rewrite history itself. Even today, historians still debate why this happened. Was it revenge, political correction, or simply an attempt by later rulers to restore traditional order? Ancient Egypt rarely leaves clear answers. Instead, it leaves shadows. And those shadows are often where the most interesting stories hide. But Hatshepsut was not the only figure who challenged expectations. Egyptian history is filled with rulers who blurred the line between myth and reality. Some pharaohs tried to reshape religion itself. Others attempted to centralize all divine power under their control. And in doing so, they often created conflict with the powerful priesthood that controlled temples and rituals across the land. Because in Egypt, religion was not separate from politics. It was politics. The temples were not just places of worship, they were centers of influence, wealth, and authority. And whoever controlled the gods often controlled the people. This constant struggle between throne and temple created a silent tension that ran through centuries of Egyptian history, a tension that could elevate a ruler to greatness or erase them from memory entirely. And as we move further into this ancient world, we begin to realize something important. The secrets of Egypt are not only buried in tombs and pyramids, they are also buried in power struggles, in forgotten names, in rewritten stories, and in the silent decisions made behind closed doors of stone palaces. But our journey is still far from over, because beyond queens who became kings and kings who feared their own priests, there are even darker and more mysterious chapters waiting ahead. Stories of cursed tombs, lost revolutions, and pharaohs who tried to defy death itself. So as the desert wind continues to move over forgotten sands, we step forward once again into the deeper secrets of ancient Egypt.
As we go deeper into ancient Egypt, the story begins to feel less like history and more like something whispered. Because here, death was not the end. It was a transition, a dangerous journey into another world filled with judgment, spirits, and uncertainty. The ancient Egyptians believed that life did not stop when the body stopped breathing. Instead, the soul continued forward into the afterlife, where it would be judged by the gods. And because of this belief, death was treated with a level of seriousness that shaped almost everything they built, especially the tombs. For the pharaohs, a tomb was not just a resting place, it was an eternal home, a carefully designed gateway into immortality. Inside these tombs, everything was prepared as if the king would wake up again tomorrow. Food, jewelry, furniture, statues, even servants were sometimes symbolically included to serve in the afterlife. The goal was simple: to continue life forever, without interruption. This is why the pyramids were built with such precision, gigantic stone structures aligned with astronomical accuracy, designed to protect the body of the ruler for eternity. But the more effort they put into protecting death, the more fear seemed to grow around it. Over time, stories began to spread among workers, priests, and later generations. Stories about disturbances, strange events, and the idea that some tombs were not meant to be disturbed. One of the most famous modern examples of this fear comes from the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb. When archaeologists uncovered the sealed chamber, it felt like stepping into a moment frozen in time. Everything inside was untouched for thousands of years, and that discovery shocked the world. But soon after, something even more fascinating happened. A series of unexpected deaths among people connected to the excavation began to spread rumors. Newspapers called it a curse, the curse of the pharaohs. Suddenly, science and superstition collided. Some believed the tomb carried ancient protection spells meant to punish intruders. Others insisted it was coincidence, bad timing, or natural causes exaggerated by fear and media attention. But regardless of the explanation, the idea of a curse captured global imagination because it fit perfectly with what people already felt about Egypt, a civilization so advanced, so mysterious, so deeply connected to death that it almost felt unreal. But beyond the myths, the truth is more human. Tombs were protected not by magic, but by belief. Inscriptions warned against disturbing the dead not because of supernatural power, but because the Egyptians believed in justice after death. To violate a tomb was to disrupt cosmic order, and cosmic order was the foundation of their entire worldview. Still, the fear remained. And fear has a way of surviving longer than facts. As centuries passed, the pyramids became silent monuments of that fear and ambition, gigantic reminders of a civilization that tried to outlast time itself. The time, as always, continued moving forward. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, cities disappeared into sand, and Egypt itself transformed into something new. Yet the pyramids still stood, watching, waiting, reminding the world that something once existed here that refused to be forgotten. And as we move closer to the final chapters of this journey, one question begins to rise above all others. Was ancient Egypt truly obsessed with death? Or were they simply more honest about it than we are today? Because in the end, every civilization must face the same truth. No matter how powerful, no matter how rich, no matter how divine it believes itself to be, time always wins. And even the pharaohs who once believed they could escape it, now exist only in stories carved into stone. But our journey is not finished yet. Because beyond the tombs and curses, there are still deeper mysteries waiting beneath the desert sands. Secrets of lost cities, forgotten gods, and the final fate of a civilization that once believed it could never end.
As we move deeper into the final chapters of ancient Egypt, the tone of the story begins to change. What once felt like a powerful, eternal civilization slowly starts to feel fragile. Because even the greatest empires in human history eventually reach a point where their foundations begin to crack. And Egypt was no exception. For thousands of years, ancient Egypt had been held together by something incredibly strong. Not just armies, not just kings, but belief. Belief in the gods, belief in the pharaoh, and belief that the world itself was stable and unchanging. But over time, that belief began to shift. Because Egypt was not isolated. It was constantly interacting with neighboring civilizations, trading, fighting, and absorbing outside influences. And with every new contact, new ideas began to enter the land of the Nile. New gods, new cultures, new ways of thinking. And slowly, the old order began to lose its absolute authority. One of the most dramatic moments in this shift came during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten. He did something that shocked the entire religious system of Egypt. He challenged the traditional gods. For centuries, Egypt had worshipped a vast pantheon of deities, but Akhenaten pushed forward a radical idea that there was only one true god, the Aten, the sun disk. At first, this may sound like a simple religious reform, but in reality, it was a complete revolution, because by changing religion, Akhenaten was also changing power. The priests who controlled temples lost influence, old rituals were abandoned, temples were closed, and a new capital city was built to reflect this new belief system. Everything about Egypt was being reshaped around a single idea. But revolutions rarely come without consequences. After Akhenaten's death, the old religious system quickly returned. Temples were reopened, the old gods restored, and Akhenaten himself was almost erased from official memory. His reign became one of the most mysterious and controversial periods in Egyptian history, a reminder that even the most powerful rulers cannot easily rewrite thousands of years of tradition. But the weakening of internal unity was only part of Egypt's decline. Outside forces were growing stronger: Assyrians, Persians, and later the Greeks. Each empire arrived with greater military strength and more advanced political systems. One by one, Egypt lost control over its own land. And yet, even in decline, it remained deeply respected, because Egypt was not just another kingdom, it was a symbol of ancient wisdom, mystery, and endurance. Eventually, in 332 BCE, Alexander the Great entered Egypt and was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Later, the Ptolemaic Prunsti would rule Egypt, blending Greek and Egyptian culture together in a final attempt to preserve its identity. And among its most famous rulers was Cleopatra VII, a queen remembered not only for her political intelligence, but also for her role in the final collapse of independent Egypt. With her death, ancient Egypt as a sovereign civilization effectively came to an end. But something interesting happened after that. Egypt did not disappear. It transformed. Its gods were forgotten or merged into new belief systems. Its language slowly faded. Its political power was absorbed by empires. But its monuments remained. The pyramids still stood. The temples still whispered stories through stone. And the deserts still held secrets buried beneath shifting sand. Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover new discoveries: hidden tombs, unknown chambers, and artifacts that challenge what we thought we knew, as if Egypt is still quietly revealing itself, piece by piece, to anyone willing to listen. So when we look at ancient Egypt today, we are not just seeing a civilization that ended thousands of years ago. We are seeing a legacy that refused to disappear, a world built on belief, ambition, fear, and the dream of eternity. And maybe that is the greatest secret of all, that Egypt was never truly about pyramids or pharaohs. It was about humanity's oldest desire: to be remembered, to be eternal, to never truly fade away. And as our journey comes to an end, we are left with a quiet realization
The sands of Egypt may cover its cities, but they will never fully bury its story.
And so we arrive at the final stretch of our journey, a place where history stops feeling like dates and dynasties and starts feeling like an echo, a quiet echo that still moves through the sands of Egypt today. Because even after thousands of years, ancient Egypt does not feel completely gone. It feels paused, like a story left unfinished, waiting for someone to continue reading it under the desert sky. But before we reach the end, we need to understand something important. Ancient Egypt did not collapse in a single moment. It did not fall like a statue being pushed over. It faded, slowly, quietly, like ink disappearing into water. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Life continued along the Nile as it always had. Farmers planted crops when the river rose. Temples still received offerings. Priests still whispered prayers to the gods. And pharaohs, at least in name, still ruled. But beneath this surface of continuity, something was changing. Power was no longer centered in one unshakable place. It was splitting between foreign influence and local tradition, between old beliefs and new ideas, between memory and reality. And as that balance weakened, Egypt began to feel less like a unified empire and more like a collection of inherited stories trying to hold themselves together. One by one, outside forces tightened their grip, not always violently, sometimes politically, sometimes culturally, and sometimes simply by being stronger, more organized, or more adaptable. Empires do not always destroy other empires, sometimes they simply replace them, and Egypt, once the center of ancient power and mystery, slowly became part of something larger than itself. But even as political control shifted, something remarkable remained unchanged: the identity of Egypt. Because even when rulers changed, the land itself did not forget. The Nile still flooded, the desert still stretched endlessly, and the pyramids still stood like silent witnesses to everything that had come before. Time could take power, time could take language, time could take kings, but time struggled to take stone. And so Egypt began to live two lives at once, one life in the present, and one life preserved in the past, a past that was becoming harder and harder to understand. As centuries passed, the old meanings of temples and symbols began to fade. What once was obvious became mysterious. What once was sacred became forgotten. Hieroglyphs turned into silent art rather than readable language. Temples became ruins rather than living spaces of worship. And the gods slowly became myths, not because they stopped being believed in overnight, but because belief itself changed shape. New religions spread across the region. New empires brought new ideas about life, death, and divinity. And gradually, the ancient Egyptian worldview, so deeply connected to balance, order, and eternal cycles, was replaced by different ways of understanding existence. Still, Egypt did not vanish. It transformed again, like it had done so many times before. Under Greek and later Roman influence, Egypt became something new, a cultural fusion, a meeting point between worlds. Its libraries, cities, and scholars continued to influence the wider Mediterranean world. Even in its later form, Egypt was not silent. It was evolving. But the original voice of ancient Egypt, the voice of the pharaohs, the old priests, the pyramid builders, was slowly becoming distant. And then it became memory. But memory has its own strange power, because even when a civilization disappears, its symbols remain, and symbols can survive longer than truth. Long after the last pharaoh ruled independently, Egypt continued to exist in the imagination of the world. Travelers came and stared at its monuments in confusion. How were they built? Why were they built? What kind of people could create something so massive, so precise, so enduring? The pyramids became questions carved into stone, questions with no easy answers. And that uncertainty gave Egypt a second life, a mythological life, a version of Egypt that grew larger in mystery as real understanding faded. Then came a moment that would change everything again, the rediscovery of ancient Egypt. Centuries passed where the original meaning of hieroglyphs was lost completely. They were seen as decorative symbols, not a language. But then, slowly, scholars began to unlock them again, piece by piece, letter by letter. A forgotten world started speaking once more. And when it did, the modern world realized something shocking. Ancient Egypt had not been a simple civilization of superstition and mystery. It had been incredibly advanced. Mathematics, engineering, medicine, governance, astronomy, a deeply structured society with knowledge that had survived millennia, hidden in plain sight. And suddenly, the pyramids were no longer just monuments, they were engineering mysteries. The temples were no longer just ruins, they were records of a sophisticated belief system.
The tombs were no longer just burial sites, they were carefully constructed maps of the afterlife. But even with all this knowledge restored, something still remains unknown, because Egypt is not a solved puzzle. It is still incomplete. There are chambers yet to be fully explored, texts yet to be fully understood, and artifacts that continue to challenge what historians believe is possible. Even today, new discoveries appear from beneath the sand, as if the land itself refuses to stop revealing its secrets. And maybe that is the most fitting legacy for Egypt, a civilization that never fully allows itself to be finished. But beyond archaeology and science, there is something deeper that keeps Egypt alive. Its emotional power. Because when people look at the pyramids, they do not just see stone. They feel time. They feel distance. They feel something ancient and unreachable, yet strangely familiar. And that is because, at its core, ancient Egypt was never only about gods or kings or tombs. It was about a very human question. What happens when we are gone? How do we make sure we are not forgotten? The pharaohs tried to answer that question with pyramids, with gold, with names carved into eternal stone. But the real answer turned out to be something they may not have fully expected. They are remembered not because they conquered eternity, but because they tried to. And that effort alone was enough to preserve them. So as we reach the end of this journey, the deserts of Egypt grow quiet again. The temples stand still. The Nile continues its slow movement, as it always has. And beneath the sand, countless stories remain buried, waiting, not for resurrection, but for discovery. And perhaps the greatest truth of ancient Egypt is this: it is not a civilization that belongs only to the past. It is a civilization that still exists in fragments, in stone, in memory, in curiosity, and in every person who looks at those ancient monuments and feels, even for a moment, that time is not as simple as it seems. And so our journey ends here, not with an ending that closes Egypt forever, but with a silence that continues it, because some stories are not meant to finish. They are meant to echo forever.
And even after everything we've uncovered, ancient Egypt still doesn't feel fully revealed. It feels like a sealed room where the door is open just a little, enough for light to enter, but not enough to see everything inside. Because every time we think we understand Egypt, something new is found. Something forgotten reappears. Something changes the story again. And that is where our final chapter begins. Not in the past, but in the present. In the world of modern archaeology, where silence is broken not by myths, but by excavation tools scraping against stone that hasn't been touched for thousands of years. For a long time, people believed Egypt had already given up most of its secrets. The pyramids were mapped, the tombs catalogued, the temples studied. But Egypt, it turns out, was only waiting beneath layers of sand, dust, and time. And the truth is simple: we are still finding it. One of the most fascinating things about modern Egyptology is how often discoveries completely rewrite what we thought we knew. Not small corrections, but entire missing chapters of history. Hidden tombs appearing in places already explored, sealed chambers behind walls that looked solid for centuries, and artifacts that don't fit existing timelines. It's as if Egypt refuses to be fully solved. And maybe that is exactly what makes it eternal. Because unlike many ancient civilizations, Egypt did not vanish into a single forgotten ruin. It became layered, like a giant archive buried under itself. New cities built on top of old cities, new temples constructed beside older ones, and sometimes even reusing ancient stones in new structures as if time itself was recycling history. And deep beneath modern Egypt, archaeologists continue to search, carefully, patiently, sometimes for years, just to uncover a few meters of buried truth. And when something is found, it is never just interesting, it is disruptive. Because each discovery forces historians to adjust the story again, to redraw maps, to rethink timelines, to question assumptions. One of the most mysterious aspects of Egypt today is how much of it is still hidden underground, not metaphorically, literally. Entire tombs remain undiscovered, burial chambers sealed by collapsed rock, subterranean corridors that lead into darkness with no clear destination. And every now and then, scans reveal something unusual. Empty spaces inside pyramids, hidden voids that no one can fully explain. Not natural formations, not clearly accessible rooms,
just gaps, as if something was intentionally left unseen. And that alone is enough to keep curiosity alive, because Egypt was not built randomly. Every structure had purpose, every alignment had meaning, every chamber had intention. So when modern technology detects something unusual, it immediately raises questions. What was meant to be there? And why was it hidden? But Egypt's secrets are not only buried underground. Some of them are buried in plain sight, in museums, in collections, in artifacts that were discovered long ago but still aren't fully understood. Objects with unknown symbolic meaning, inscriptions that remain partially undeciphered, and historical records that contradict each other depending on interpretation. Even now, scholars disagree on basic timelines, on the roles of certain rulers, on the meaning of certain religious shifts, because ancient Egypt was not a simple linear story. It was layered with reinterpretations, political changes, and cultural transformations. And that complexity is exactly why it continues to fascinate the modern world. But there is another reason Egypt never feels fully solved, and it is not archaeological, it is emotional. Because ancient Egypt is not just something we study, it is something we imagine. We project onto it. We fill its gaps with questions, theories, and wonder. When people see the pyramids, they are not just looking at stone, they are looking at possibility. The possibility that humans once built something that challenges modern understanding. The possibility that ancient knowledge was deeper than we expect. The possibility that history is not as complete as textbooks suggest. And that feeling is powerful, because it reminds us that the past is not fixed. It is something we are still discovering, piece by piece, year by year, dig by dig, and sometimes even mistake by mistake. But beyond science and excavation, Egypt still survives in another way, in culture, in storytelling, in global imagination, in films, books, documentaries, and endless interpretations. Every generation rebuilds Egypt in its own way, sometimes as a mysterious empire, sometimes as a lost world of advanced knowledge, sometimes as a spiritual symbol of life and death, but always as something greater than ordinary history. And maybe that is Egypt's real secret. It is not just an ancient civilization. It is an idea that refuses to disappear. A symbol of eternity created by people who truly believed in eternity. And even though the pharaohs are gone, even though their names are sometimes uncertain, even though their kingdoms have long fallen, their question still remains. What does it mean to last forever? And we, standing thousands of years later, are still trying to answer it. Every excavation, every discovery, every reconstructed artifact, every decoded inscription, all of it is part of the same effort. To understand a civilization that believed memory to defeat time. So as we come to the end of this journey, there is no final door closing, no final secret revealed, no complete explanation, only continuation. Because Egypt does not end. It extends. Through sand, through stone, through silence, and through curiosity. And perhaps that is why, even now, in the quiet of the desert, it still feels like something is watching. Not in fear, not in mystery, but in patience. As if ancient Egypt is still waiting for the world to understand just a little more. And when we think we finally have, it will simply reveal another secret, and another, and another, until time itself decides the story is complete. But until then.
And now we reach the final layer of our journey into ancient Egypt. Not the layer of kings, not the layer of pyramids, not even the layer of tombs or forgotten gods, but something deeper, something quieter, something that doesn't sit in museums or temples, but in the way Egypt still exists inside human imagination. Because after everything we've explored, one truth becomes unavoidable. Ancient Egypt was never just a civilization. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest fears, ambitions, and unanswered questions. Time, death, power, legacy, identity. All of it was written into stone thousands of years ago, and all of it still feels familiar today. But if we truly look at Egypt's final mystery, it is not found in a tomb. It is not hidden under a pyramid. It is not even locked inside a sealed chamber. It is something far more unsettling. The fact that we still cannot stop searching. Even after centuries of discovery, even after thousands of excavations,
Even after endless research papers and decoded inscriptions, Egypt still feels incomplete. And maybe that incompleteness is intentional, because ancient Egypt was built on the idea of eternity, not just in religion, but in architecture, in politics, in identity. Everything was designed to last longer than human life, to resist forgetting, to challenge disappearance itself. And yet time did what time always does. It changed everything. Languages faded, beliefs transformed, cities disappeared under sand, and empires replaced one another like waves washing over the same shore. But Egypt remained, not as a living empire, but as a preserved question. And questions, unlike empires, do not collapse. They grow, they spread, they evolve. That is why even today, Egypt continues to pull attention from across the world, because every generation believes it might finally be the one to understand it fully. And every generation discovers it was wrong, not because we know nothing, but because there is always more. More chambers, more symbols, more interpretations, more contradictions, and more silence where answers should be. Even the pyramids themselves still refuse to become simple. They are not just tombs, not just monuments, not just engineering achievements. They are something between certainty and mystery, solid enough to measure, but strange enough to question forever. And that tension is what keeps Egypt alive in modern thought. But there is something even deeper happening beneath all of this, something psychological, because ancient Egypt represents a rare combination of two things humans are drawn to endlessly: structure and mystery. We know it existed, we can touch its ruins, we can read parts of its language, we can trace its rulers, but we cannot fully reconstruct its inner world. And that gap creates imagination, and imagination fills silence more aggressively than facts ever can. That is why Egypt appears everywhere, in stories, in movies, in theories, in debates, even in dreams of lost knowledge or hidden chambers. Because Egypt is not just history, it is unfinished understanding, and unfinished understanding never becomes boring. It becomes eternal. But there is still one final idea we must face before ending this journey. A simple thought, one that ancient Egypt itself seemed to understand better than we do. Everything ends, but meaning does not. The pharaohs knew they would die. That is why they built tombs. The priests knew power would shift. That is why they recorded rituals. The builders knew sand would eventually cover stone. That is why they carved deeper. Everything they did was an attempt to negotiate with time, not to defeat it, but to delay forgetting. And in that attempt, they succeeded more than they could have imagined. Because today, thousands of years later, we are still here, still speaking their names, still studying their symbols, still trying to reconstruct their thoughts, still standing in front of their monuments, feeling something we cannot fully explain. And that feeling is the real legacy of Egypt. Not gold, not mummies, not even pyramids, but persistence. A civilization that refused to disappear completely, even when everything around it changed. So as we come to the end of this final chapter, there is no dramatic conclusion waiting, no final revelation that solves everything, no hidden truth that ends the mystery forever. Instead, there is only continuity, because Egypt was never designed to end neatly. It was designed to endure, and endure it did. In fragments, in ruins, in stories, in questions, and in us. Every time we wonder about it, every time we try to explain it, every time we feel drawn back to it, ancient Egypt continues again. Not as history, but as something still unfolding in thought. And maybe that is the final secret, that Egypt was never lost. It was simply transformed into curiosity itself. And curiosity never truly dies, it only deepens. So when the desert winds move over the silent stones tonight, and when the pyramids cast their long shadows under the moon, remember this. Ancient Egypt is not behind us. It is still with us, waiting, watching, and continuing, as long as we continue to ask.
And now, we arrive at the final chapter. Not because Egypt has ended, but because our journey through it must pause here. And even that feels strange to say, because ancient Egypt has a way of making endings feel temporary, as if every conclusion is only another beginning hidden in disguise. So instead of closing the story, we step into its silence, the silence beneath the sand. Because if there is one thing Egypt teaches us more than anything else, it is that silence is never empty. It is full of what we do not yet understand, full of what we have forgotten, and full of what we may never fully recover. For thousands of years, the desert has been doing something remarkable. It has been preserving. Not just stone, not just bones, but entire worlds beneath its surface. Cities swallowed slowly by shifting dunes. Tombs sealed so tightly that even time struggled to enter. Temples buried not in destruction, but in patience. And that patience is still ongoing, even today, right now. Somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt,
There are structures that no human eye has seen in modern history, chambers that remain untouched, corridors that lead into darkness without explanation, and relics that have not yet been named, classified, or fully understood. And the most unsettling part is not that they exist, but that we already know they are there. We just have not reached them yet. So Egypt continues to exist in two forms at once: the Egypt we have discovered and the Egypt that is still waiting. And between those two versions lies a space filled with imagination, because every new discovery does not end mystery, it expands it. When archaeologists find a tomb, they do not find closure, they find questions. When they decode a symbol, they uncover another layer of meaning beneath it. When they map a temple, they realize there is another structure hidden nearby. Egypt never gives answers alone. It gives answers wrapped in new uncertainty. And perhaps that is why it has survived so powerfully in human memory, because certainty fades, but mystery spreads. And Egypt is one of the most persistent mysteries in human history. But beyond archaeology, there is something even more profound happening here, something emotional. Because when people think of ancient Egypt, they are not just thinking of facts, they are thinking of scale, time scale, human scale, cosmic scale. They are thinking about what it means to build something meant to outlive you, to place your identity into stone. And that belief is what makes Egypt feel different from other ancient civilizations, because it is not just about what they built, but why they built it. Everything points back to one central idea, that life is temporary, but meaning does not have to be. So they carved meaning into walls, into tombs, into statues, into entire cities designed to align with stars. They turned architecture into belief, and belief into permanence. But permanence, as we know, is always tested by time, and time always wins, eventually. Yet Egypt resisted that outcome in its own way, not by stopping time, but by surviving inside it, layered beneath it, hidden within it, and rediscovered by it. And now in the modern world, Egypt exists like a living contradiction. It is ancient, yet continuously studied. It is silent, yet constantly speaking through discoveries. It is buried, yet constantly resurfacing. And maybe that is why it continues to feel alive. Because Egypt is not locked in the past, it is still interacting with the present. Every excavation is a conversation. Every artifact is a message. Every inscription is a fragment of thought reaching across millennia. But even with all of this, one truth remains unchanged. We will never fully finish Egypt. Not in our lifetime, not in the next, not even in centuries to come. Because Egypt is not a problem to be solved. It is a perspective to be experienced. A reminder that history is not complete. It is ongoing. And we are only reading the parts that have surfaced so far. So as this final chapter unfolds, there is no dramatic ending waiting for us. No final secret revealed in full clarity. No final door opening to complete understanding. Instead, there is only continuation. The same continuation that has existed since the first stone was placed in the desert, since the first tomb was sealed, since the first name was carved into eternity. And now, thousands of years later, we are still part of that same story. Because every time we wonder about Egypt, we bring it back to life again. Every time we search for answers, we extend its existence a little further. And every time we share its mysteries, we keep it from becoming silence. So perhaps the real ending of ancient Egypt is not an ending at all. It is participation. A shared human curiosity stretching across time. And as long as that curiosity exists, Egypt continues. Not as ruins, not as dust, not as forgotten history, but as something alive in thought, something alive in imagination, something alive in the questions we still ask when we stand before stone that refuses to be ordinary. So when the desert finally falls quiet, and when the wind moves across the pyramids like a slow breath through time, remember this. The story of ancient Egypt is not behind us. It is beneath us, around us, and still unfolding whenever we choose to look again.